On the night of October 8, 1871, the small logging town of Peshtigo, Wisconsin, became the site of one of the deadliest and most devastating wildfires in American history. A confluence of unfortunate circumstances led to the perfect storm of destruction. A prolonged drought had parched the land, high winds fanned the flames, and an unchecked practice of slash-and-burn agriculture created the ideal conditions for an inferno. The town, situated in the heart of Wisconsin's booming lumber industry, was filled with sawmills, wooden buildings, and vast stretches of dry forest. An entire landscape primed for catastrophe. What began as a distant glow on the horizon soon became a living nightmare as the firestorm descended upon the town, engulfing everything in its path with a ferocity that defied comprehension. The wind-driven blaze spread rapidly, moving so fast that many residents had no time to react. As the flames surged forward, they ignited everything they touched: homes, churches, businesses, and entire stretches of forest. The atmosphere itself became charged with fire, creating a massive inferno that consumed the town in mere hours. As the flames approached, the residents of Peshtigo had little warning. The fire moved at an unprecedented speed, whipped into a frenzy by hurricane-force winds that carried burning embers miles ahead of the main blaze. Survivors would later describe the sound of the fire as a roaring freight train, its deafening howl accompanied by the constant cracking of exploding trees. The intense heat generated its own weather system, creating a firestorm that lifted houses into the air, melted iron, and turned sand into glass. The skies turned a deep, hellish red, and the air became so superheated that people burst into flames simply by being too close to the fire's core. Horses, cattle, and wildlife stampeded in panic, their frantic cries drowned out by the inferno's terrible symphony. Some people tried to escape by running towards open fields, only to find themselves trapped by walls of fire that had formed in every direction. Others sought shelter in cellars or wells, but many suffocated as the flames consumed the oxygen around them. The wind drove the firestorm across the landscape, sparing nothing in its path, turning a once thriving town into a blazing hellscape within hours. The only hope for survival lay in the Peshtigo River, where hundreds of residents sought refuge in the water. Men, women, and children waded in as deep as they could, submerging themselves repeatedly to escape the searing heat. Yet even in the river there was no true safety. Flaming debris rained down from above, setting clothing alight and burning those desperately clinging to logs or each other. The suffocating smoke made it nearly impossible to breathe, and many drowned in their attempts to stay submerged. Some clung to wooden beams, only to watch in horror as they caught fire in their hands. Parents held on to their children, only to realize that the fire had already taken them. It was a night of unimaginable horror, and for those who survived, the trauma would never fade. Those who made it through described a scene of utter destruction as they emerged from the river. The once thriving town had been reduced to smoking ruins, with entire families wiped out in the blink of an eye. The ground was covered with ash, charred bodies, and the remnants of what had once been a bustling community. In just a few hours, Peshtigo was reduced to ashes. The flames moved so quickly that entire families perished before they had a chance to flee. The heat was so intense that it left no remains in some areas, only scorched earth where homes and businesses once stood. Over 1,200 people lost their lives in the blaze, though the true number will never be known, as entire families were wiped out with no one left to report their passing. The fire burned an estimated 1.2 million acres, consuming everything in its path, including neighboring communities and forests. It was a level of destruction so complete that it left nothing but silence in its wake, a landscape transformed into a charred wasteland where even the soil itself had turned to cinders. The sheer scale of devastation made it one of the worst natural disasters in U.S. history, yet its legacy was largely overshadowed by another fire that occurred on the same night. What made the Peshtigo Fire even more tragic was that it occurred on the same night as the Great Chicago Fire, which captured national attention due to the city's prominence. While Chicago's blaze was devastating, destroying a large portion of the city, it paled in comparison to the sheer loss of life and destruction in Peshtigo. Yet, due to Chicago's media coverage and economic significance, Peshtigo's tragedy remained largely overshadowed in history. Relief efforts were slow, and survivors were left to pick up the pieces with little outside assistance. Those who had lost everything were forced to rebuild from the ashes, but the psychological scars ran deep. Many survivors could not even speak of that night without breaking down, haunted by the images of loved ones consumed by flames and the eerie silence that followed. Some found themselves unable to stay in the area, choosing instead to move elsewhere in hopes of escaping the memories. Others, however, remained, determined to rebuild despite the overwhelming loss and devastation. The aftermath of the fire revealed the true extent of its horrors. Bodies were found in grotesque positions, frozen in their final moments of agony. Some were discovered clutching each other, fused together by the heat. Others had turned to nothing but dust, leaving only iron tools or melted glass to mark where they had once stood. The town's church bells had melted, and metal safes had warped from the unbearable temperatures. Even the landscape itself bore witness to the fire's fury. Entire forests had been reduced to smoldering stumps, and the very sand on the shores of Green Bay had been transformed into glass by the sheer intensity of the heat. It was a level of devastation so complete that even seasoned firefighters and rescue workers were left speechless. Reports from survivors spoke of an eerie silence that followed the fire, as if the land itself had been stripped of life. The scale of loss was unimaginable, and for those who lived through it, the memories of that night would haunt them for the rest of their days. For those who survived, the road to recovery was long and painful. The town of Peshtigo was rebuilt, but it was never the same. The scars of that night remained in the hearts and minds of those who lived through it, and stories of the fire were passed down through generations. Even today, remnants of the fire can still be found, charred artifacts, melted metal, and the occasional discovery of fused glass in the soil. The Peshtigo Fire Memorial stands as a solemn reminder of the tragedy, a place where visitors can pay their respects to those who perished in one of history's most overlooked disasters. The town, though rebuilt, never fully recovered from the trauma of that fateful night. Many who survived lived with nightmares and lingering fears, forever scarred by the memory of a fire that turned their home into a living hell. The Peshtigo Fire remains a chilling testament to the power of nature and the fragility of human existence. Though time has passed, the memory of that night endures, etched into history as the night when fire rained from the sky and turned an entire town into a hell on earth.